Hey guys, another one take review as well as the 16th entry in my Rock Hall Review series where I talk about one album by each of the current year's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame nominees, and then later on I discuss if they should get in or will they get in, etc. And today I'm talking about none other than iconic synth pop duo Eurythmics. More specifically, I'm talking about the album Sweet Dreams Are Made of This, and while many would probably argue that Touch is Eurythmics' most accomplished album due to the fact that it has some of what many people consider to be the best of 80s new wave music, Sweet Dreams Are Made of This obviously gave the band their biggest hit with the title track, as well as the fact that I do think beyond that song, there's some really underrated stuff here that really kind of goes under a lot of people's radar as it sort of lays in the shadows of the hit single that is the title track. First of all, Sweet Dreams Are Made of This is a painfully 1980s record. Even if you had absolutely no knowledge on the history of music, you were, just locked in your house for the last 50 years, had no idea what music from the 80s sounded like, you probably would still be able to guess this came from the 80s. That's how 80s this album sounds. And it carries that tone throughout most of it, and it can't be faulted for it. I mean, it did come out in the 80s. What do you expect? But it does carry those classic cheesy synths and that overall tone throughout the record, and I think that some songs utilize it better than others, but if anyone is listening to this that doesn't like 80s synth pop, or at least some sort of 80s trademark music, then they probably actually guaranteed to not like this album for the most part at least. But if you're like me and you're pretty comfortable with that sound for the most part, you'll probably end up at least finding something to enjoy in this, whether it be the vocals of Annie Lennox or the production or the instrumentals. But my point is, it all depends whether you enjoy this album, it all depends on how much 80s you can take in one sitting. It could definitely be argued that Annie Lennox's voice is the main selling point for Eurythmics and the main selling point for Sweet Dreams as an album. I mean, after all, she just has this cloud of mysteriousness surrounding her voice, and she's basically the vocal personification of some sort of neo-noir science fiction film, which is great because that really does make Sweet Dreams an interesting record with some incredibly interesting songs that just very much stand out in the sort of massive tidal wave that was synth pop in the 80s. And I do think that there's at least a good amount of songs here that kind of are unique, at least in the crowd. I won't say that this is a standout record overall or anything like that. There are obviously better bands and better albums than Sweet Dreams in terms of 80s synth pop, but at the same time, I do think that it's largely to Annie Lennox's credit that this record doesn't just fall to being another so-so synth pop record, and it does elevate itself to something quite good, in my opinion. Adding to the uniqueness of this record is the lesser-known half of the Eurythmics duo, David Stewart, whose instrumentation and compositions here are actually very interesting and very underrated, in my opinion. They sort of elicit the same feeling that you get from the neon signs that you'd expect in your favorite Philip K. Dick novel, which, I mean, that should be Do I Enjoy Stream of Electric Sheep, obviously, that's the correct answer. Niche sci-fi authors that I enjoy aside, there is a sense of science fiction surrealism here that is greatly built up by the instrumentals that, again, makes Sweet Dreams a very interesting album that isn't just the basic cheesy synth. Well, it is cheesy synths, but it's cheesy synths done in a way that makes them so goofy and cheesy and over the top that they actually become very, very likable and interesting again. It's sort of almost a paradox with how this album and how synth pop as a whole works, especially now in 2022 where we have the synth pop revival. So it makes everything that was synthy in the 80s sound weirdly fresh again when 10 years ago it sounded like the most outdated music on the planet. So it's really just a matter of do you like synth pop or not, of whether you're going to find things interesting or not. But if you do and you haven't heard this record before, I do recommend it because I do think that it is a very interesting and unique record. Again, not a standout in terms of quality and consistency, certainly not, but in terms of just uniqueness, I think this is definitely one to get your hands on. I digress, as I was saying before. Even though Annie Lennox is undoubtedly the selling point and the primary reason to listen to Eurythmics, I do think that David Stewart is just an incredibly essential member of the band that really builds up the atmosphere that the Eurythmics, even though they're not really known for it, probably should be known for it, because that really is what greatly defines their sound, especially on some of the more kind of dark tracks. In fact, I actually think this album and Eurythmics as a outfit were at their best when they were doing their darker material, and this record especially picks up that tone in the second half of the album. Of course, there is the hit single title track I mentioned before, but there are lesser known songs that are equally, if not better than Sweet Dreams Are Made of This, the song, such as The City Never Sleeps and Somebody Once Told Me. Let's pretend like I didn't have this Smash Mouth song stuck in my head and I didn't call the Eurythmic song Somebody Told Me, Somebody Once Told Me, and allow us to move on. Well, I think that saying this album sounds sinister would be very incorrect. I will say that Eurythmics' sound here is kind of almost cloaked in mystery. It feels like David Stewart and Annie Lennox built almost some sort of fictional universe or world that not only their entire discography, but especially this album takes place in, that none of us are quite aware of. So overall, Sweet Dreams Are Made of This may be dated, don't get me wrong, but it's an incredibly interesting record, and with a sort of atmosphere that's very neo-noir and almost sci-fi gothic at times, I do think that it stands out in the 80s crowd, and I'm gonna have to give it a 4 out of 5. It's a strong record, and I highly recommend it. Now, this is usually the part of the review where I do my little sign-off, say, see you guys in the next video, but this is my Rock Hall review series, my second to last episode of my Rock Hall review series, so I have to discuss, do Eurythmics belong in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and will they get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? And as far as do they deserve to get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I do think they do. I think they're easily one of the most successful 80s synth pop acts. Just look at how incredibly popular the single from this song, or this album, is. You've also got tracks like Here Comes the Rain Again that are just incredibly popular even today. They're radio staples. They've gotten certified with different levels of credentials of, gold and whatnot, that are obviously suggesting a major amount of commercial success even today. And I have noticed there's a slight rebirth of interest and popularity for Eurythmics lately. I have no idea why. Again, like I said, the whole synth pop revival thing may have something to do with that. And that also leads me to the fact that Eurythmics are pretty influential today. I do think that, without realizing it, a lot of artists like Dua Lipa, when she released Future Nostalgia, took some notes from Eurythmics. I'm not saying that they, are directly ripping off artists like Eurythmics. Obviously, the modern synth pop revival is taking a lot of its own steps in its own direction to make it its own unique genre. But still, I do think that bands like Eurythmics were doing a lot of things that modern synth pop artists are doing decades earlier, and now people are just starting to realize that fact. As far as will they get in, that's a little more difficult. As far as this year goes, I don't think they'll get in. I don't think they have a shot this year. They've been nominated once before, though, so that does show that the Rock Hall Committee at least acknowledges them, There's just some artists that get nominated once, and then they never get nominated again, and then they get forgot about. Cough, cough, the Replacements. Cough, cough, the Smiths. So I do think that Eurythmics, they'll get in eventually, probably pretty soon, especially because Annie Lennox, and at least to a lesser extent David Stewart, are very popular individuals in pop culture as well. I would actually maybe argue that more people know who Annie Lennox is than they know who Eurythmics is. And Annie Lennox has a pretty praised solo career as well, and David Stewart is widely respected within the industry, so I do think that they will get in eventually. I just don't think this year is going to be their year, and I think there's too stacked of a ballot. I think there's too many other more likely 80s acts like Duran Duran to get in this year, and overall I just don't think they've got a shot this year, but within the next 5 for sure, maybe 10. So yeah, overall, I think that Eurythmics deserve to be in. I don't think they'll get in this year, but nonetheless, Sweet Dreams is a great album that I do highly recommend. I'll give the album a 4 out of 5. They absolutely do deserve to be in, and it's just I don't think they'll get in this year. So yeah, 4 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that's the end of this review. Join me next time for the next entry in the series, where it actually gets to be my last entry of the series already. It feels like this went by really quick. And also, it took forever at the same time. It's strange. But my point is, next episode is my final episode for the series. Hopefully, if I'm still doing this by next year, I'll revisit the series next year, do it for next year's nominees. The next episode is Kate Bush, and I'm not talking about Hounds of Love, so be excited to, hear me discuss an album that not everybody talks about, The Dreaming, which is a personal favorite of mine from her. But until then, that is the end of this review, and I'll see you guys in the next one.